If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. Those are the words of one of our beloved South Africa's founding fathers, Bishop Desmond Tutu, and these words have come back to haunt South Africa. As we all know, on the 24th of February 2022, Russian forces invaded Ukraine and occupied most of the eastern region of that country. And South Africa finds itself caught in the middle of this war, as we refuse to take sides and instead call for peace talks between these two countries, despite the West pressuring us to side with them in condemning Russia. And many people are asking themselves, why is South Africa caught in the middle? Why can't we just pick a side? Well, this is a bit complicated, and to understand the complexity of South African international relations concerning this war, let us delve into the history of South Africa and the ANC in connection to Russia and the world of geopolitics. Until 1917, Russia was governed as a monarchy known as the Russian Empire, and the region of Crimea was part of this empire, primarily inhabited by the Russians from the year 1783. However, following the October Revolution in 1917 by the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, a socialist faction of this party called the Bolsheviks successfully overthrew the monarchy and established the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic and put all means of production like land, mines, companies and factories under government's control. Crimea also became part of this newly formed socialist republic. Alongside this transformation, several neighboring countries also adopted socialist ideologies, and together they united to form the United Socialist Soviet Republic, USSR, commonly referred to as the Soviet Union, and emerged as a formidable powerhouse in global politics. During this period of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the union's leader at the time, transferred Crimea from Russia to Ukraine's jurisdiction, citing reasons such as the geographical proximity and the strong economic and cultural ties between the Crimea province and Ukraine. This was at the peak of the Soviet Union's power and resulted in a phenomenon commonly referred to as the Red Scare. This is because the United States and its European allies were terrified by this new communist system of government, as they believe it threatened the system of capitalism and the capitalist class, who were also the main funders of the political class in the US and Europe to maintain the status quo. The US committed itself to fighting and containing communism to make sure it doesn't spread westward to threaten their imperialist investments. They did so by adopting the Truman Doctrine policy, also known as the policy of containment. This foreign policy mandated the US to provide political, military and financial support to democratic countries that were under the threat of communist influence. The end goal of this policy was to prevent the expansion of communism, as it threatened the private ownership of businesses and properties by the top 1%. But during the World War II, they had to briefly put their differences aside and work together to defeat their common enemy, Adolf Hitler. After World War II and the defeat of Hitler, the Nazi Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Great Britain, France and the Soviet Union. The 3 western zones controlled by the United States, Great Britain and France were merged to form the Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, commonly known as the West Germany, and the Soviet Union zone became the German Democratic Republic, GDR, commonly known as the East Germany. The division of these 2 German states was primarily driven by the ideological differences and the different political goals of the occupying powers. And the Red Scare started right where it left off and led the whole world to the Cold War. The Soviet Union government suspected that the Western powers might attempt to forcefully seize the East Germany and merge it back with the West, as the East German people were escaping and flocking to the West in numbers. In response to these concerns, a barricade known as the Berlin Wall was constructed, separating Berlin and effectively dividing the West and East Germany. This wall had far-reaching consequences, as it didn't only just divide Germany but the whole world. It geopolitically split the world into the Western Bloc, led by the USA, and the Eastern Bloc, led by the USSR. 31 Western countries led by the US banded together and formed the Intergovernmental Military Alliance, known as the North Atlantic Alliance, abbreviated as NATO. According to their website, they say it was formed to secure peace in Europe and to promote cooperation among its members and to guard their freedom. All of this in the context of countering the threat posed at the time by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union perceived this as a military encirclement, and in response they formed the Warsaw Pact, an intergovernmental military alliance similar to NATO, but consisting of its neighboring socialist countries. The creation of this pact alongside the construction of the Berlin Wall gave rise to the figurative political border known as the Iron Curtain, and marked the beginning of the Cold War between the USA-led Western Bloc and the USSR-led Eastern Bloc. The USA and USSR engaged in a competitive race to have greater influence in the global South, which consisted of former colonies gaining newfound independence from the European countries. These newly independent countries often experienced power struggles and civil wars, as their former colonizers wanted to install puppet regimes under the guise of democracy in order to continue exploiting and looting those countries. So the United States would supply these puppet governments with weapons to suppress opposition under the pretext of protecting democracy, while on the other hand, the Soviet Union supported an armed liberation movement that rejected the bad deals their puppet regimes had with the former colonizers and were advocating for total political emancipation from them. This often led to civil wars and proxy wars in the global south. And this is what is commonly referred to as the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. During this era of the Cold War, South Africa was subjected to the apartheid system that enforced racial segregation, deprived black people of basic rights, and imposed severe restrictions on their lives, as they were confined to rural areas and townships, and their freedom of movement was restricted by the pass laws, which mandated the possession of internal passports known as the Donbas. Despite the brutal nature of this system, the United States and several European countries initially supported the apartheid government, as they perceived it as a safeguard against communism in the region. Instead of condemning the apartheid, they instead labeled freedom fighters like Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo as terrorists. On the 23rd of March 1960, the ANC and the PAC jointly led defiance campaign, marching to the police stations without carrying their Donbases and demanding for the pass laws to be scrapped. The police opened fire on the crowd, killing 69 and wounding 186 black people in what is known as the Sharpeville massacre. Following this massacre, the Soviet Union withdrew its ambassador from South Africa, and the anti-apartheid struggle intensified and the repressive methods by the government became more violent. To defend themselves against the increasingly violent regime, Nelson Mandela and other leaders went into hiding and established the armed wing of the ANC, which became known as Umkhonto weSizwe, with Mandela as its first commander.
Clear declaration that this campaign is being run on peaceful and non-violent lines close the chapter as far as our methods of political struggle are concerned. There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences in this stay at home, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
Soon after this, Nelson Mandela and other leaders were arrested after the CIA tipped off the apartheid government on their whereabouts. Following their arrest, the president of the ANC at the time, Chief Albert Luthuli, predicted that the situation would worsen and potentially leading to the banning of the ANC. He therefore instructed his deputy, O.R. Tambo, to go into exile and mobilize ANC's international support in condemning and opposing the apartheid system. Tambo settled in London, England. Soon after, the apartheid government indeed banned the ANC, assassinated its president, Chief Albert Luthuli, and sentenced Nelson Mandela and his co-accused comrades to life imprisonment in what was known as the Rivonia trial, leaving the ANC almost leaderless. But Chief Luthuli's remarkable wisdom and foresight ensured that should there be a leadership vacuum, O.R. Tambo would just be in place to assume leadership of the ANC in exile. And indeed, he took over and served as the organization's president for the next 30 years.
The struggle against apartheid should be intensified at all fronts.
Over this period, Oliver Tambo relentlessly traveled the West, mobilizing support for the ANC in its fight against the apartheid government. He addressed the United Nations, highlighted the oppressive nature of the apartheid government, and called for international solidarity and action against the regime. In 1966, the UN adopted a non-binding resolution stating that apartheid was a crime against humanity by 91 votes in favor. Only 4 countries, namely Portugal, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and the United States, voted against the adoption of this resolution. So without the support of the two most influential Western superpowers, this resolution was doomed and meant nothing, as it was also non-binding. Most of the Western countries, including those who initially supported it, also ended up disregarding it and continued trading with the apartheid South Africa. This is when the ANC gave up on the West and started seeking support from the Soviet Union in the East to assist with funding and military training of Umkhonto weSizwe. The Soviet Union welcomed the ANC with open arms and provided it with much needed financial and military support. Despite refusing to offer the necessary assistance to the ANC when they begged for it, the Western countries still had the audacity to express disapproval of the fact that the ANC was receiving support from the communists. This led to them and their media houses criticizing the ANC and branding it a terrorist organization.
When we asked Oliver Tambo about his ties with the communists, he gave us this response.
During the last World War, Britain, the United States, France were fighting Nazi Germany. So was the Soviet Union, a socialist state. They fought this common enemy together until they defeated it. What was the matter with that?
Well, that depends.
In South Africa, we have the apartheid system. It is related to the Nazi system. Same origins, same behavior, same character. Denounced worldwide. Every South African, the churches are fighting this system. Communists, anti-communists, women, workers, everybody. What is the matter with that?
Dr. Tambo,
What is the problem? What is the problem about the ANC, an organization, finding itself, fighting a system which other South Africans who happen to be members of the Communist Party are also fighting? What is the matter with that?
You know, the Americans must look back into their own history. You did not hesitate to work with Stalin against Hitler. You were sending shipments of food and material via Murmansk and other ports in the Soviet Union in order to fight Hitler. Why should it be reprehensible on the part of the ANC to do the same? To have alliances so that it wages a successful struggle? I think we are unfair to the African National Congress. And I think the American taxpayers must not support us on the basis of choosing friends for us. I think you must respect our decisions to have our own friends. Please don't dictate to us. We must decide who our friends are. I think it's a bit of arrogance to tell us with whom we should associate. I mean, that's really patronizing, and I think the ANC doesn't like that.
One of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies. We are grateful to the world for supporting our struggle. But nevertheless, we are an independent organization with its own policy. Our attitude towards any country is determined by the attitude of that country to our struggle. That is the position.
The US government classified Nelson Mandela as a terrorist on the FBI watch list until 2008, despite his prominence as a global figure and every US president of the time pretending to love him for clout. The ANC enjoyed these attacks and constantly had to explain itself for associating with the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, the Soviet Union continued supporting the ANC until 1990. That is because the state collapsed in 1990 and was split into 15 sovereign countries, including Russia and Ukraine. But since the capital and administrative city of the Soviet Union was in Moscow, Russia became the successive state that inherited and upheld most of the Soviet Union's institutions, policies, diplomacies, and their relations. The ANC, which the Soviet Union had supported throughout its liberation struggle against the Apartheid, became the governing party of South Africa in 1994, and the ANC and Soviet Union relations became the South Africa and Russia relations. But equally so, South Africa also has a good relationship with Ukraine, as it was a major part of the Soviet Union, and equally assisted the ANC in its fight against the Apartheid. So why are our friends fighting? How did we get here? So on the 9th of November 1989, 2 years before the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Berlin Wall was demolished, leading to the reunification of the East and West Germany. The East Germany then withdrew from the Warsaw Pact and became a member of NATO. On the 9th of February 1990, the Soviet Union and NATO leadership met to discuss the arrangement of this new development to avoid violence. The Soviet Union said they would only allow East Germany to reunite with the West Germany on the condition that the unified Germany will not be part of NATO. During these negotiation talks, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, was asked by a NATO representative, would you prefer a united Germany outside of NATO that is independent and has no US forces, or would you prefer a united Germany with ties to NATO and assurances that there would be no extension of NATO's current jurisdiction eastward? Gorbachev didn't have an immediate answer and asked to be given time to think about it. He gave his answer later on and chose the latter option, and they allegedly agreed in principle that the East Germany was the only and last country from the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact to join NATO, and that from there on, NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. I'm saying allegedly because this information is highly contested right now, despite the declassification of the documents. But then the Soviet Union collapsed a year later in 1991 and resulted in the formation of 15 independent countries, including Russia and Ukraine. But I'm curious to know, when a state collapses, does it mean whatever agreements it had with other states are then null and void? Because Russia is a big brother of these 15 former USSR countries, seem to have inherited this agreement that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. And the first conflict between Russia and Ukraine was regarding the nuclear weapons that were in Ukraine. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia wanted all former Soviet Union countries to send the warheads back to Moscow, but Ukraine refused, until the USA interfered and convinced Ukraine to give up the weapons, and in return the USA promised to protect them militarily. But besides this, the newly formed Ukraine had another internal problem that still persists even to this day. Its citizens are ethnically divided into West Ukrainians who speak Ukrainian and are leaning towards European values and want to be part of the EU and NATO, and the East Ukrainians who speak Russian and still uphold most of the Soviet Union values and ideologies and allegedly want to be part of Russia. This ethnical division culminated in a political division and always plays itself out during elections. For example, in 2004 Ukrainian elections, Viktor Yushchenko, whose constituency was the Western Ukrainians, squared off with Viktor Yanukovych, whose most loyal supporters were the East Ukrainians. Yanukovych won, but the international election observers denounced the election as unfair, leading to the Orange Revolution, and the Ukraine Supreme Court overturned the results and ordered a rerun. Yushchenko then won the rerun, and soon after assuming office, he started efforts to join EU and NATO to fulfill the wishes of his supporters, who were mainly the Western Ukrainians. The EU was welcoming of this application, but Russia was not comfortable with it, as they felt like the EU was violating the agreement NATO had with the Soviet Union, and Russia doesn't see NATO and EU as separate entities. But in 2010 Ukrainian elections, Yanukovych contested again, and this time around won and became president of Ukraine. On the 17th of December 2013, Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed to lend Ukraine $15 billion in financial aid and gave Ukraine a 33% discount on natural gas prices, on the condition that Ukraine will withdraw its application to join the European Union and join the Eurasian Economic Union instead. Then on the 21st of November 2013, Yanukovych suspended preparations for signing the European Union Association Agreement and instead applied to join the Russia-led Eurasian Economic Union. To no one's surprise, this angered the Western Ukrainians, and they embarked on violent riots known as the Revolution of Dignity, and police responded with violent tactics to stop the uprising but failed. Yanukovych eventually fled the country in 2014 and went to Russia for protection. On the 22nd of February 2014, the Ukrainian parliament then voted to remove him before his term ended, on the grounds that he had withdrawn from fulfilling his constitutional duties. The parliament then scheduled an early presidential elections for the 25th of May 2014. Basically, this was a coup d'etat allegedly sponsored by the West.
That the United States had something to do with the ousting of Yanukovych, and he had to flee to Russia.
I know this for sure. It is very simple. We have thousands of contacts and thousands of connections with people who live in Ukraine. And we know who had meetings and worked with people who overthrew Viktor Yanukovych, as well as when and where they did it. We know the ways the assistance was provided. We know how much they paid them. We know which territories and countries hosted trainings and how it was done. We know who the instructors were. We know everything. Well, actually, our US partners are not keeping it a secret.
Following the elections of that same year, Petro Poroshenko succeeded him and reinitiated talks to join the EU. Russia noticed that it had lost influence in Ukraine. Then Russian troops invaded and annexed a Ukrainian region known as Crimea in 2014 and reminded everyone that Crimea had historically been part of Russia's territory, and Nikita Khrushchev shouldn't have transferred it to Ukraine in the first place. A referendum on Crimea rejoining Russia was held in March 2014, and 95.5% voted to join Russia. Russia then built the Crimea Bridge for cars and railway to connect Crimea to Russia. Soon after the annexation of Crimea, the Donbas War started, as new separatist rebel groups suddenly emerged in its eastern part of Ukraine. They took control of government buildings and established two self-proclaimed republics, namely the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, and declared themselves independent from Ukraine. Ukraine's government saw this as an attack on their territorial integrity and launched a military operation against them to regain the control of the government's buildings and country's territory. This resulted in the infamous Donbas War, fought between the armed forces of Ukraine and the armed separatist rebels that were allegedly funded and armed by Russia. A Minsk agreement was signed to end the war, and it was agreed that these two republics in Donbas region would be given a special status. But this never happened, as the Ukrainian government reneged and refused to pass the legislation that would implement the agreement and grant the promised special status to these two Donbas region republics. Ukraine justified this by raising concerns about the failure to establish effective control over the border between Ukraine and Russia, and accused the separatist groups of allowing Russian people and soldiers to freely move in and out of Ukraine without following proper procedures. Also demanded that these separatist groups lay down their weapons and disarm themselves before the Donbas region could be fully granted the special status. But the separatist groups refused, and the war continued for 7 years. Ukraine applied to join NATO in 2008, but its application was not immediately approved. And in 2010, following the election of Viktor Yanukovych, Ukraine withdrew its NATO application as Yanukovych was pro-Russia. However, following his removal by the Ukrainian parliament and the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014, Ukraine elected a pro-Western Petro Poroshenko as president, and he reapplied for NATO membership again in 2017. In 2019, a comedian Zelensky was elected as president of Ukraine, replacing Poroshenko. 3 years later, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. This invasion intensified the urgency for Ukraine to seek protection and pressured NATO to approve its membership, which was promised. However, during the NATO summit held in Lithuania from the 11th to the 12th of July 2023, NATO still refused to grant Ukraine membership or even provide specific time frame for its potential inclusion, leaving Zelensky feeling like an outsider. The official statement from NATO said, open quote, "We will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when all allies agree and conditions are met," close quote, without elaborating any further. But it turns out that one of the requirements to join NATO and the EU is that a country must be stable and not be engaged in any form of war. So the Donbas War and the current full-scale Russia-Ukraine war destabilized Ukraine and disqualified the country from being eligible to join NATO or the EU. But nevertheless, due to suspicions that Russia was arming and supporting the Donbas separatist groups, NATO decided to secretly support the Ukrainian forces, despite Ukraine not being a member of NATO yet. Russia interpreted this as a military encirclement and a continued violation of the Soviet-NATO agreement that NATO would not expand eastward. As a result, in late 2021, Russia started moving its tanks and troops to the Russian-Ukrainian border and demanded that NATO withdraw from eastward expansion and move back to where its borders were in 1997, failure of which Ukraine would be invaded to protect Russia from NATO's expansion. Then, while Ukraine was still refusing to pass legislation to grant the Donbas region their promised special status, Russia passed a bill to officially recognize these two self-proclaimed republics on the 21st of February 2022. Then, on the 24th of February 2022, Russian forces moved into the region and Putin claimed it was just a special military operation for peacekeeping. But this was actually the invasion of Ukraine, as Russia occupied Donbas region. And in October 2022, Russia facilitated an annexation referendum for Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, which received enormous support. However, this was widely criticized internationally and described as a sham referendum. This invasion and the annexation of the Donbas region marked the actual start of the current Russia-Ukraine war. South Africa's Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Naledi Pandor, pleaded with Russia and Ukraine to meet and talk it out. Answering a question in Parliament 2 days before the invasion, she had this to say, open quote, "South Africa's position has been and still is continuing to encourage all parties to strengthen all diplomatic efforts to avoid an escalation of tensions and to work towards an inclusive, sustainable and peaceful solution based on cooperation and dialogue. In this regard, South Africa encourages all parties to approach dialogue with the spirit of compromise in order to move the process forward without accusing any party, which is something that would not be helpful in the efforts to resolve the conflict. South Africa stands by its principled position of peaceful resolution of conflicts," close quote. So South Africa has constantly maintained a neutral stance and supported peace negotiations even before the war started. But there has been a robust European and American propaganda effort aimed at portraying South Africa as aligning with Russia, including false claims by the US ambassador to South Africa that we have supplied Russia with weapons. South Africa became a target because we couldn't be bullied by them, and they are frustrated over South Africa's role as the host nation for the BRICS summit, which aims to establish a multipolar world order and reduce the dominance of United States and Europe. So when all is said and done, South Africa asked both countries to sit and resolve their differences through a dialogue, and the United States and NATO kept telling Ukraine to fight so they could supply them with weapons to test and advertise to bolster their military-industrial complex. But history has no blank pages, and as Fidel Castro once said, history will absolve us. So following the invasion, the United States and other NATO and EU members immediately called for sanctions to be imposed on Russia. And on the 2nd of March 2022, an emergency special session of the United Nations General Assembly of 193 member states was convened to vote on whether Russia must withdraw its troops from Ukraine. The majority of 143 countries voted in favor of the withdrawal, including Israel, which is hypocritical. However, 5 countries, including Russia itself, voted against the resolution, while 35 countries chose neutrality and abstained from voting. Among these 35 countries, 4 were BRICS members, namely India, China, and South Africa. Brazil stood out as the only BRICS country that voted in favor of the resolution and aligned itself with the West. This is because the then far-right Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro was the Western darling and puppet who did everything to please the West, which resulted in Brazilians uniting to remove him and replace him with Lula da Silva. Lula is a leftist and pro-East. It is therefore unlikely that Brazil will continue to vote in line with the West as it did during Bolsonaro's term in office. For example, Lula has already fixed Brazil's relationship with Venezuela. He invited Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro to Brazil after he was banned from visiting the country by the pro-West Bolsonaro in 2019 following Venezuela's sanctions by the US. Also, during Zelensky's visit to the G7, there was a meeting scheduled between him and Lula, but Zelensky kept Lula waiting and failed to show up without any explanation. This did not sit well with Lula, leading him to ignore Zelensky upon his arrival at the G7 meeting, while everyone else was greeting and hugging him. Therefore, all BRICS countries will most likely take a a neutral stance going forward. And South Africa's neutral stance in this matter is guided by ANC's foreign policy of non-alignment. On the 24th of March, another vote took place concerning the condemnation of attacks on civilian populations and infrastructure in Ukraine. Again, South Africa abstained. Then, on the 7th of April 2022, United Nations adopted a resolution suspending Russia's membership in the United Nations Human Rights Council due to grave concern regarding human rights violations and the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, which were attributed to Russia. South Africa abstained. Subsequently, on the 12th of October 2022, the UN passed a resolution declaring the referendums held in Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics aimed at annexing them into Russia to be illegitimate and a sham. The resolution called for the return of those regions to Ukraine. South Africa once again abstained from voting. On the 14th of November 2022, another UN vote was held to determine whether Russia should provide war reparations to Ukraine through the establishment of the International Reparations Mechanism. Once again, South Africa chose to abstain. Throughout all these instances, South Africa justified its abstentions by openly expressing the belief that condemnation should be equal for both Russia's action in Ukraine and Israel's actions in Palestine.
They don't apply international rules or law equally in all circumstances. So you can't say because Ukraine has been invaded that suddenly sovereignty is important, but it was never important for Palestine. It's very peculiar. If you believe in international law truly, then wherever sovereignty is infringed, it must apply. And this is the point we've been making, that we use the framework of international law unequally, depending on who is affected. And we are arguing that that must change. So our argument is, let's revise the international multilateral system to ensure that we observe that post-1948 has arrived.
You talk too much!
This stance created tensions between South Africa and the Western countries, particularly their big brother, the United States of America, which doesn't want to acknowledge the atrocities of Israel in Palestine. Adding to the strain, on the anniversary of the invasion, South Africa, China and Russia conducted a joint military exercise in South Africa, which was interpreted by the West as South Africa aligning with Russia, and South Africa was then threatened with secondary sanctions by the US.
To our friends in South Africa, you do joint naval exercises with Russia and China on the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine by Putin, you're going to have problems.
Before this joint military exercise, a US-sanctioned Russian ship named Lady R arrived in South Africa to deliver weapons that were bought by South Africa from Russia and to deliver Russian weapons that were going to be used for the joint military exercise. The US ambassador in South Africa, supported by the far-right and pro-West opposition party called the Democratic Alliance, made unfounded claims in the media, falsely stating that South Africa sold weapons to Russia and were loaded onto the Lady R cargo ship.
Think is the relationship, and what does the ANC stand to gain from a close relationship with Vladimir Putin and overall Russia?
Well, let me just be very clear. I don't think South Africa has a non-aligned position. I think they've made it very, very clear by their deeds, by their words, that they are definitely on the side of Russia.
This baseless allegation negatively impacted the value of the South African currency, the rand, and further strained relations between South Africa and the collective West, particularly the USA. However, an inquiry into this allegation exonerated South Africa and found that no weapons were loaded onto that cargo ship. But neither the racist Democratic Alliance nor the US ambassador with his ugly bow tie issued an apology for misleading the public. Despite this, the US continued spreading propaganda and accusing South Africa of aligning and arming Russia in its war against Ukraine, citing as evidence the aforementioned joint military exercise, the docking of US-sanctioned Lady R cargo ship in Cape Town, and the authorized landing of the US-sanctioned Russian military cargo plane at Waterkloof Air Force Base in April 2023. And the fact that the International Criminal Court issued the warrant for Putin's arrest on charges of war crime, and South African government declined to pledge his arrest if he had attended the BRICS summit in South Africa in August 2023. Funny enough, the loudmouth United States is not even a signatory of the ICC, because they know they would have to arrest all their former presidents for their terrorist actions and atrocities around the world. This is the very same United States that threatened the very same ICC judges with sanctions if they issued warrants of arrest and charged any American who served in Afghanistan with war crimes. So, the United States has no moral standing to speak on matters of war crimes, let alone lecturing South Africa on how to deal with crimes against humanity. So they can take a backseat on this one. We will not be bullied by them.
If there is a country that has committed unspeakable atrocities in the world, it is the United States of America. They don't care. They don't care for human beings. They are so arrogant. they decided to kill innocent people in Japan who are still suffering from that. Who are they now to pretend that they are the policemen of the world?
Following Bolsonaro's electoral defeat and Lula's election, the United States' grip on Brazil as their puppet state diminished. They subsequently redirected their focus towards South Africa and increased pressure to have us side with them, as they perceived us as the weakest link among all BRICS countries. Their attempt was to bully us into submission and align with their interests to uphold the all-for-wits doctrine at the expense of the BRICS group and the collective South. They didn't want to see the BRICS summit succeed and did everything in their power and influence to try and sabotage it. When the International Criminal Court (ICC) demanded that South Africa arrest Putin during his attendance at the summit, as expected, the far-right racist opposition party in South Africa, the Democratic Alliance, made a statement expressing their support for Putin's arrest, and even went as far as pledging to arrest him themselves should he attend the summit, which was quite laughable.
There's no flip-flopping here in the Western Cape. If Vladimir Putin comes here, our law enforcement officers will arrest him and send him to the courts.
The DA went as far as using its financial muscle to display costly billboards calling for Putin to be arrested and took the government to court. However, the South African government firmly refused to comply with such demands, as they continued advocating for dialogue as the best path forward, and ended up convincing Putin not to attend the summit instead, as there were also fears of a planned assassination upon his arrival in SA. Arresting a sitting president in a foreign country is not a simple thing. In an interview with Given Mkhari, the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, once discussed the complexities of arresting leaders during the times of war.
So, there must be an end to the killing to achieve peace. To deal with the justice thing, you must charge those who are responsible for killing people. You know what it means? If you implemented that, it means there would be no peace in South Sudan. Because what it means is you must arrest the current president of South Sudan and charge him. You must arrest the principal leader of the opposition and charge him. The first question you must answer, who's going to arrest them?
Mr. President.
And even if you arrested them, these are the two people you need to make peace. You need them to make peace, to say to their fighting forces, stop the fighting, lay down your guns. You need those two. Without them, you're not going to achieve that.
But the thing is, the West is not interested in peace and justice. They just want victory and to maintain their global dominance, and are prepared to use other countries as pawns to achieve this goal, as they did during World War II and Cold War. And Ukraine is a perfect candidate for a proxy war against Russia, just as Taiwan is the perfect candidate for a proxy war against China in the near future. All they want at the end is to maintain their hegemony so they can continue policing and bullying the world. South Africa, on the other hand, is a developing country, and we're not interested in any of that nonsense. We just want peace and stability so that we can exploit opportunities to grow our economy without being dictated by any other country. But I must say, the persistent attempts by the US to draw South Africa into its proxy war with Russia are irritating even to a layman like myself, and have only heightened the tensions between the US and SA. This war has restricted the export of grain from Ukraine and fertilizer from Russia, and intensified the global food insecurity. Africa, which depends on the import of both, has suffered the most. As a result, South Africa and other African countries have high inflation right now. This is why African leaders persuaded Putin to allow Ukraine to ship grain through the Black Sea. So unlike China, which only speaks to Russia, and the United States, which only speaks to Ukraine, South Africa speaks to both countries and tries to bring both sides to the negotiating table. As we maintain strong relations with both Russia and Ukraine, and want to use our friendship to foster peace between these two countries. So on the 15th of June 2023, the African leaders and delegates from Egypt, Senegal, Congo, Comoros, Zambia, and Uganda, led by South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, traveled to Ukraine and Russia on a peace mission and spoke with both sides. Regardless of how insignificant our voice might be in geopolitics, but we took the right path by talking to both parties instead of choosing sides. But despite all this effort to find peace, it is also noteworthy that the West didn't make this trip easy for President Cyril Ramaphosa. He had to travel to Ukraine on a train without his complete security team, as Poland, which is part of NATO, grounded his security plane, claiming they didn't have permission for the weapons they were carrying. It was all an effort to frustrate President Cyril Ramaphosa, hoping he'd cancel his peace mission trip. But because he is Mandela's protege and committed to peace, and also understands how this war is impacting South Africa and other African countries, he proceeded anyway and put his life in danger just for the sake of peace.